Get ready for a deep dive into a case that, well, it went far beyond just shocking France. This is the Gisèle Pelicot case.
It really became a symbol, I think, of a reckoning that was, well, long overdue, really, with sexual violence. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. The scale of this case is just, it's staggering. Dominique Pelicot convicted of drugging and raping his wife Gisèle for over a decade. But, and it's a big but, he also involved dozens of other men, leading to a trial, get this, with 51 defendants. It's almost unfathomable.
What makes it even more complex, I think, is Gisèle Pelicot's decision to waive her anonymity. In cases like this, that's almost unheard of, but she wanted the trial to be public.
That's incredibly brave, don't you think? After everything she went through, to speak her truth on such a public stage, it's remarkable.
It is. She wanted a world to see, to understand, and she wanted to hold the perpetrators accountable.
Absolutely. But before we go any further, can you, for those maybe not familiar with the details, walk us through the trial and the verdict?
Yeah, of course. The trial itself, it was a spectacle, really, lasting 15 weeks. The details that came out were, well, frankly, they were horrifying.
I can imagine.
Dominique Pelicot admitted to the crimes. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And of the 50 men accused of raping Gisèle, 47 were found guilty.
Wow.
There were 2 others found guilty of attempted rape and 2 more of sexual assault.
47 men found guilty of rape. Those numbers are just staggering. Were they all given prison sentences?
Most of them, yes. But here's the thing about the French legal system. 6 of the men, they were released. They'd already served time while they were awaiting trial.
I see. So it raises the question then, didn't it, of whether justice was truly served in those cases?
It does, yeah. It makes you think.
Definitely. But beyond the legal aspects of it all, I think what's really, really captivating about this case is the human element. Gisèle Pelicot's decision to speak out, to do it so publicly. She said in one of the sources, and this is a quote, "I'm a totally destroyed woman, but I wanted to publicize my case to change society." What an incredibly powerful statement.
It is. Think about it. The courage to not only acknowledge her own pain, but to then try to use it to create change. She wasn't just seeking justice for herself, but for other victims, too.
She was saying, in essence, the shame isn't ours to feel, it's theirs.
Exactly. And by theirs, she means the perpetrators. And, her courage, it had a real impact. Remember those demonstrations across France? Thousands of people marched in support of Gisèle.
It was like a movement, wasn't it? People were suddenly talking about consent, about power dynamics, about how society often silences victims.
Right. It was a turning point. It forced people to confront some very uncomfortable truths. And it wasn't just limited to France. This case garnered global attention. It shone a light on a global problem that so often stays hidden.
It's like her bravery gave others permission to come forward with their own stories and demand better. It's really inspiring, I think. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about Dominique Pelicot himself. What can we learn from the psychological analysis of this man?
Well, this is where things get really disturbing. The psychiatrists who evaluated Pelicot, they didn't find any signs of severe mental illness.
So not the classic "he's a madman" defense. He knew what he was doing.
Precisely. He was deemed mentally competent to stand trial, but one psychiatrist described him as having a split personality. He compared it to a computer hard drive with separate, isolated compartments.
A hard drive. So you're saying different parts of his personality were totally walled off from each other.
Yeah.
That's almost, I don't know, more terrifying than outright madness, isn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests he was aware, in control.
That's what makes this case so unnerving. During the trial, Pelicot was described as being confident. Sometimes he even seemed bored, totally unfazed by the gravity of what was happening, by the pain he had caused.
It's like he couldn't or wouldn't grasp the enormity of his actions. So 17 of the men convicted decided to appeal their sentences. What about Dominique Pelicot himself? Did he appeal his 20-year sentence?
He did not. His lawyer said that Pelicot didn't want to put Gisèle through another ordeal. He claimed that an appeal would go against, contradict his position, that Gisèle was never his adversary.
That's a strange stance to take, especially given his apparent lack of remorse during the trial. What do you make of that? Is it genuine, or is it just another manipulation tactic?
It's hard to say, but it's a fascinating question. And remember, under French law, there has to be a new trial with a jury within the next 12 months. So a lot of uncertainty still. A jury could impose even harsher sentences.
So much intrigue in this case. It makes you wonder how all the media attention, the scale of the crimes, how it will all play into the jury's decision. But before we get into the appeals, let's dig a bit deeper into this split personality idea. Is there a clinical term for what Pelicot might have? Could it explain what he did?
Well, it's possible he shows traits of antisocial personality disorder. It's characterized by a lack of empathy, a disregard for others. Doesn't mean he's legally insane, but it's a way of maybe understanding his behavior.
So, not legally insane, but deeply flawed, capable of calculated cruelty. And here's where it gets really interesting, right? Could this just be the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Dominique Pelicot's crimes?
That's a question investigators are asking. Remember those two estate agents we talked about? One attacked in 1999, the other, Sophie Narmy, murdered in 1991.
Right. DNA linked Pelicot to the 99 attack, but the 91 murder is still unsolved. Do they think there's a connection?
It's a possibility they're looking into. And what's interesting is, according to one of the lawyers, Pelicot, he only confesses when there's undeniable proof. It's like he enjoys the game, pushing things as far as he can.
Chilling. It suggests a real lack of remorse. And it brings us to the whole world of cold cases, unsolved crimes that can linger for years. But DNA technology has revolutionized that field, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. DNA evidence can crack open a case that seemed hopeless. Like, think of it this way. Every contact leaves a trace, and even traces from decades ago can now be analyzed.
Wow. So even if a crime happened years ago, there's still hope.
Yeah, it's like a glimmer of hope.
It's also a deterrent, right? Knowing that even a tiny bit of DNA could come back to haunt you. But back to the Pelicot case. Do you think he's capable of more than we know, given what we've learned about him and those cold cases?
Yeah,
It's a scary thought.
it's hard to say for sure. But, well, the evidence suggests a pattern of disturbing behavior. We're dealing with a convicted rapist, a potential serial predator, a web of crimes spanning decades, and the legal system is trying to make sense of it all.
This is heavy stuff. We've covered a lot. This case is far from over. But before we get into the appeals process and the potential for new investigations, let's just take a minute to think about everything we've learned. What are some of the key things that stand out to you?
The contrast, the darkness of what Dominique Pelicot did, and Gisèle Pelicot's incredible courage. She wouldn't be silenced. And by speaking out, she started a conversation about sexual violence and justice, a conversation that needed to happen.
Absolutely. It's about resilience, the power of speaking your truth. But we also have to confront the unsettling questions this case raises about evil, the limits of our justice systems, the link between psychology and crime.
And the fact that Dominique Pelicot was found guilty, sentenced, but we still might not know the full extent of his crimes, it makes you wonder, how do we deal with people like him, people who blur the lines between madness and calculated evil?
It's a question we all need to consider, I think. How do we balance justice with the complexities of human behavior? How do we protect potential victims, but still ensure fair trials?
Well, this deep dive has given you a look into the Gisèle Pelicot case, but this is just the beginning. The appeals are ongoing, investigations into other crimes are continuing, and the conversation about justice, it has to keep going.
And on that note, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll dive into the appeals process, the possibility of uncovering more of Dominique Pelicot's past, and the bigger impact of this landmark case.
We were talking about the possibility that the crimes that Dominique Pelicot has been convicted of, that they might just be the beginning, right?
It's scary to think about. Those two estate agents, one attacked back in 1999 and the other, Sophie Narm, murdered in 91. We know the DNA linked him to the 99 attack, but the 91 case is still unsolved. Makes you wonder if there's a pattern there.
Investigators are definitely trying to figure that out. What's interesting is what one of the lawyers said, that Pelicot, he only confesses when he's caught red-handed, when there's absolute proof.
It's like he gets off on it, doesn't he? Testing the limits, seeing how far he can go. Makes you wonder if 20 years, if that's even enough, for someone like that.
The justice system, it's designed to punish specific acts. But what about when you have someone like Pelicot? With such a complex personality, potentially dangerous, how do you even measure the harm he's caused? Especially if there are more crimes we don't know about yet.
And how do you rehabilitate someone who might not even admit to everything they've done? But let's go back to those possible past crimes for a minute. We talked about DNA technology in cold cases. Could you explain that a bit more? What are the odds of finding evidence in a case like Sophie Narm's murder? That was over 30 years ago.
DNA technology has really changed everything. Years ago, a case like Sophie Narm's, it might have stayed cold forever. But now, even a tiny bit of DNA can be crucial evidence. It's like every time you touch something, you leave a little bit of yourself behind.
And those traces, they can last for decades.
Right. And we can analyze them now in ways we couldn't before.
So even after all these years, there's still a chance to find answers.
Exactly. There's hope. And it's not just about solving old crimes, it's a deterrent too, you know? Criminals know that their DNA could link them to a crime scene even years later.
Makes you think twice. Okay, so let's talk about those appeals. 17 of the men convicted alongside Dominique Pellicot, they're appealing their sentences. Can you break down how that works in France? What could happen?
Sure. In France, anyone convicted of a crime, they can appeal to a higher court. It's basically a review. They look for mistakes that might have been made in the first trial, like problems with the evidence or with how things were done.
So it's not just automatic. They could overturn the convictions, reduce the sentences.
They could even order a whole new trial.
Adds another layer to it all, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And Dominique Pellicot, he decided not to appeal his own sentence. Could that affect the appeals of the other men? I mean, he'll have to be a witness, right?
Oh, absolutely. His presence could change things. He's a charismatic guy, manipulative, what he says, how he acts. It could influence the jury or the judges.
It's like a chess game, isn't it? And in the middle of all this is Gisèle Pelicot. She's been through so much. Do you think the appeals, with all the uncertainty and the media attention, will it be hard for her?
It's a good question and a tough one. Even when the legal system is working as it should, it can be hard for victims. Having to go through everything again, seeing the people who hurt them, it can be really traumatic.
So it's not just about getting justice. It's about supporting the victim, too.
Exactly. And it makes you think about the bigger picture. What are the effects of a case like this on society? How has it changed the way people in France think about sexual violence and consent?
That's what we'll talk about next, right?
Yeah.
How this case changed the conversation and hopefully led to real change. So we were talking about the impact of the Gisèle Pelicot case. It definitely got people talking. But did it actually lead to any real changes?
That's the big question, right? Awareness is important, but it has to lead to something. One thing we saw immediately after the trial was a spike in reports of sexual violence in France.
So more people coming forward.
Yeah, exactly. Like Gisèle Pelicot's bravery gave others the strength to break their silence. It shows you how powerful it can be to speak up.
It changed the whole conversation, didn't it? Sexual violence went from something people whispered about to front-page news.
It did. And that kind of shift, it can change how we think about these issues, how we deal with them.
But did it change any laws or policies?
Mm.
Awareness is good, but real action is what matters.
Well, there have been some positive steps. The government started some new programs to help victims of sexual violence, and they're working on making the laws stronger, too.
That's good to hear. What about the other men, though? The ones who went along with what Dominique Pellicot was doing? How could so many people be involved? It's hard to understand.
It is. And, you know, these weren't all criminals or social outcasts. They came from different backgrounds, jobs, everything. And that's what's so unsettling. It makes you realize that even seemingly ordinary people can do terrible things.
Some had said they were manipulated by Pellicot, that they didn't know Gisèle wasn't consenting.
But the court didn't buy it.
And they shouldn't, right? I mean, not knowing isn't an excuse for something like that.
It points to a bigger problem, I think. A culture where consent isn't always taken seriously, where power dynamics and societal pressure can lead to, well, to bad things happening.
It's like a blind spot. We don't always see the ways consent can be ignored or manipulated.
Exactly. It's not just about physical force. It's about creating a culture where everyone understands and respects consent. That's the key.
And how do we do that?
It's about changing how we think, challenging the assumptions we make, and it's about teaching our kids about respect and accountability. It's not easy, but it's important if we want to stop these kinds of things from happening.
Gisèle Pelicot showed us that change is possible. She was brave enough to speak out, to challenge the way things are, and she started something that has the potential to make a real difference.
Her story is a powerful example of what one voice can do. She wouldn't stay silent. She demanded justice, and that inspired others to do the same.
Well, this deep dive has taken us into a dark place, but it's also shown us the strength of the human spirit. We've looked at the legal system, the psychology of the perpetrator, and the incredible bravery of one woman who refused to be silenced.
And it's not over. The conversation continues, the fight for justice continues, and so does the work of creating a world where these horrible crimes are no longer tolerated.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep learning about this case, to talk about it, and to do what you can to make the world a safer place for everyone.